It is said that when Timothy Caldwell was first seen walking down the frost-heavy main road into Hallows Point, he did not look like a child so much as an imitation of one, assembled from memory by someone who had never met a boy in their life. His proportions were wrong, though not in any way that could be pointed to with certainty. His face was small, the features carefully placed as though by deliberate hand, but the skin seemed stretched slightly too tight across the cheekbones, giving the illusion of a faint, constant smile. He carried nothing in his hands, wore no hat against the cold, and yet his hair, so pale it seemed almost white, never stirred in the sharp January wind. No one remembers him blinking that morning. He came from the east, from the direction of the marsh road that had not been passable for weeks due to flooding, and his boots left no marks in the ice and slush. Sheriff Langley, who had been sweeping the snow from his porch, would later swear that he saw the boy's shadow moving ahead of him half a second before his body caught up. This was dismissed at the time as a trick of the winter light, though Langley himself would never again step outside alone after dusk. People spoke of the stillness first, how the air seemed to thicken as Timothy approached. The sound of the sawmill slowed until it became a low, dragging groan. The crows along the telegraph poles froze in place, heads tilted, their eyes trained not on the boy, but on the ground directly in front of him, as though something else were pacing there just out of sight. Mrs. Halford, who ran the bakery, would say she had the strongest impression that he had already passed through Hallows Point before, not once but many times, though she could not say how or when. She would tell her sister later that she had the sickening feeling she knew his weight, the exact sound his feet made when descending her front steps, as if she had heard it all her life in dreams. Timothy's first stop was the steps of the old post office. He stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, facing the door, his hands at his sides, eyes fixed not on the brass handle, but on the narrow gap where the door met the frame. It was as though he were waiting for the wood to breathe. By then, the few who had noticed him began to gather, but always at a distance. There was a pressure about him that seemed to keep people from getting closer than 30 feet. The only one who dared approach was Dr. Kitteridge, who had been called from his small practice down the road by a nervous shopkeeper who thought the boy might be lost or injured. Kitteridge would later write in his notes, though the page was torn out before his papers were archived, that Timothy's breath steamed in the air, but rose rather than falling, curling upward in small, deliberate spirals before vanishing. He wrote also of the smell, faint, chemical, something like the fluid he used to preserve specimens, and the way Timothy's gaze slid past him without acknowledgement, as though searching for someone else who was not there. When asked his name, the boy finally spoke, though none of those standing nearby could agree on what his voice sounded like. Some swore it was deep and adult, others that it was a whisper so thin it seemed inside their own heads. But all agreed on one thing. The syllables of Timothy Caldwell seemed wrong in his mouth, as though borrowed from someone else entirely. No one knows who offered him a place to stay that night, though the widow Agnes Birchwood claimed decades later, when she was nearly blind, that she had opened her door at dusk to find him standing there without having walked up her steps. She insisted she had not invited him in, and yet, the next moment, he was standing in her front hall, looking around the dim parlor with a strange, methodical interest, as though cataloging its contents. She would also claim, though her family tried to silence her, that when she looked down to remove her gloves, she saw his pale hand just above hers on the doorknob, not holding it, but resting above it, fingers spread slightly as if measuring the exact width of her grip. That night, the wind died entirely. The chimney smoke hung in the air like frozen strands of wool. Somewhere beyond the marsh road, a single dog barked once, then never again. By morning, every clock in Hallows Point had lost 7 minutes, and Timothy Caldwell had not slept. Timothy spent that first morning in Agnes Birch's house as though he were not a guest, but a surveyor sent to map a place long abandoned. He moved slowly, his pale hands hovering an inch above surfaces without ever touching them. The air seemed to bend slightly toward his fingertips, the way dust will drift toward a charged rod of amber. Agnes sat rigid in her chair by the window, her teacup trembling faintly against the saucer, every nerve in her body tuned to his silent procession from parlor to hall, hall to kitchen, kitchen to the narrow door that led to the cellar. She could not remember whether she had locked that door the night before, but when Timothy reached for it, or rather reached for the air in front of it, the latch did not resist. It opened without the sound of metal against wood, revealing a darkness so deep it looked less like the absence of light than the presence of something that refused illumination. He did not descend. He only stood at the top step, head tilted slightly, as though listening to something far below the reach of the lantern hook. Agnes swore later she heard nothing but the blood in her own ears. Yet her hands tightened in her lap without her telling. Them, too. The knuckles whitening until the pain brought tears. Timothy remained there for a time that could not have been more than a minute, but in Agnes's memory stretched into a slow, unbearable hour. Then he closed the door again with the same soundless motion and drifted toward the back of the house, where he spent nearly half an hour standing in the threshold between kitchen and garden, watching the frost melt on the tips of the dead cabbages. By midday, a few townspeople had worked up the nerve to come calling under the pretense of welcoming the boy. None of them crossed the threshold. The moment they reached the foot of the steps, each one found themselves seized by an inexplicable reluctance, as if some old debt was owed to the house that would come due the moment they entered. They spoke to Agnes from the porch, their voices low, their glances sliding often toward the narrow upstairs windows where they thought they might see him. Once or twice they did, a pale shape moving behind the lace curtain, but it was always gone when they looked directly. Sheriff Langley came in the afternoon, not to remove the boy but to question him, though he had no crime in mind. His presence in the parlor seemed to make Timothy more still, not less, as if the law itself was a thing to be weighed and considered before any word might pass his lips. Langley asked where he had come from. Timothy said, "The place before this, one." Asked where that was, Timothy said, "The place before that." It was not evasive, not exactly, but the words had a flat finality to them, like a ledger closing. Langley, without thinking, glanced at the hearth, where a thin drift of ash lay cold against the grate. He would swear later that it had not been there an hour earlier, and that within the pale ash, the blackened imprint of a child's hand had appeared, palm down, fingers spread, as if pressed there from the inside. That night, Agnes tried to sleep, but the house had acquired a new rhythm. The clock in her bedroom ticked normally for 5 beats, then hesitated, holding the 6th as though unsure whether to go on, before catching up with a sharp, wet sound like a swallow of thick liquid. From the other side of the wall came the faint scrape of movement, not footsteps, but something shifting its weight in increments, pausing between each as if testing the strength of the floorboards. She told herself it was Timothy, though she knew he had not gone upstairs. She had lain awake until past midnight watching the door to the hall, which never once opened. Just before dawn, the boards above her bed gave a long, slow groan, as if someone were lying full length on the floor directly above her. The weight shifted, not toward the stairs, but toward the center of the room, directly over her head, and stopped. Then came a sound that Agnes could never afterward describe without trembling, a deep, deliberate inhalation, not the breath of someone filling their lungs, but the sound of something pulling in the air of the room itself, as though to taste it. When she rose at last, The house was silent again, but she found Timothy standing in the parlor, in exactly the same spot she had seen him in the day before, his pale head turned toward the cellar door. The air smelled faintly of the chemical preservative from Dr. Kitteridge's notes. The latch of the cellar door was still turned down, as though expecting to be opened, and outside, along the frost-covered fence posts at the property's edge, small handprints had appeared in the ice, not pressed in, but pushed out, as though from within. By the third day, the air in Agnes Birch's house had taken on a taste, faint but metallic, like the lingering tang of iron after a bitten lip. It clung to the back of her throat when she swallowed, and no amount of tea could wash it away. Timothy had begun to move differently now, not in the halting, surveying way of a stranger, but with a kind of proprietary quiet, as if the layout of the place had been memorized before he ever stepped foot in it. He drifted through its narrow rooms, without looking where he went, never glancing at door frames or obstacles, never once stubbing a toe or catching a sleeve. Agnes could not tell whether his eyes were leading him or whether the house itself was. On the morning of that third day, she noticed something peculiar. Every chair in the dining room had been pulled half a foot back from the table, as though the room had been prepared for guests who had not yet arrived. The backs of the chairs bore faint smears, pale against the darker polish, the size and shape of small palms, though they did not line up with where one might place a hand when sitting down. These prints were low, almost to the floor, as though left by someone kneeling. Timothy sat in one of the chairs, his hands folded loosely in his lap, looking not at Agnes but at the far wall. She followed his gaze and saw only the wainscoting and the small wooden cross that had hung there since her husband's death. Yet the longer she stood in the doorway, the more she began to feel that something on that wall was very slightly out of place. The lines between the wood panels did not seem quite true, as though the boards had swollen in strange shapes beneath the paint. It was Dr. Kitteridge's handwriting she thought of then, and his mention of the boy's unnatural persistence in confined or enclosed places. The words confined and enclosed pressed themselves into her mind until she could not resist stepping forward, touching her fingers to the warped section of paneling. It was cold. Not winter cold, but cellar cold, the kind of stillness that belonged deep underground. Timothy blinked then, very slowly, and his lips parted, but no sound emerged. For a brief moment, Agnes thought she saw the faint shimmer of condensation between his slightly open teeth, as though he were breathing something. Colder than the room allowed, she withdrew her hand from the paneling, and the cold seemed to follow her up her arm before dissipating at the shoulder. That afternoon, when the Reverend Moore came to call, she begged him, in a voice too light to be heard as a plea, to stay for tea. He agreed, though his eyes darted often toward Timothy, who sat at the table without touching his cup. At one point, the Reverend leaned in, meaning to whisper some polite reassurance to Agnes, but his words caught in his throat. His face had gone gray, his eyes fixed not on the boy, but on the faint cloud of his own breath rising from the tea. It was curling away from him, not upward as steam should, but in a slow arc toward the boy, as if drawn. By dusk, Reverend Moore had gone, leaving behind his half-finished tea and the faintest trace of damp on the tabletop in the shape of an open palm. That evening, Agnes found the cellar door ajar again, though she had kept it locked. Inside, at the bottom of the first few steps, lay a folded scrap of paper. She recognized it instantly as one of the doctor's discarded pages, torn from his notebook. There was no writing on it, only a small charcoal sketch of a human torso with the ribs drawn too narrow, the lungs absent, and in their place a dense knot of looping lines that could have been roots or veins. Timothy was in the parlor when she returned, his gaze fixed on the fire. But there was no fire, only cold ash. By the fourth night, the house began to sound wrong. Not loud, never loud, but wrong in the way a clock will seem to. Breathe if you listen too closely in a silent room. The floorboards gave no complaint under Agnes's weight, yet somewhere, deep in the beams or in the walls themselves, there was a near-constant thread of sound, soft and continuous, like fabric, being drawn across wood. At first she told herself it was mice. Then she realized it did not stop when she stood still, nor when she pressed her ear to the plaster. In fact, it seemed to grow slightly louder the longer she tried to pin it down, until she was forced to pull away, heart pounding, without having located its source. Timothy had taken to sitting in the hallway after supper, his back to the front door, his knees drawn up as though he were a much smaller child. The lamplight caught in his hair and in the faint moistness on his skin, for he seemed always to have a sheen about him now, as though he'd been standing too near boiling water. He would not look at her when she passed. His head would tilt, ever so slightly, in the direction of the sound inside the walls. She wondered whether he heard it more clearly than she did, and whether, in the darkness of night, he heard more than that. On the morning of the 5th day, Agnes found something waiting in the kitchen that froze her to the threshold. Upon the table, atop a folded dish towel, lay 7 small objects, pale and curved, each the length of a finger joint, smoothed along one edge and porous along the other. She did not need to touch them to know they were bone. Not the robust thickness of an adult's, but finer, lighter, children's bones. Her first thought was to throw them into the stove. Her second was to march them straight to Reverend Moore. Yet both impulses faltered under the sudden, unshakable sense that Timothy had placed them there for her to find. That it was not an accident, nor some unspeakable past brought to light, but an instruction. The cellar door was not ajar this time. It was wide open, and the cold that poured from it was stronger than ever. She stood on the threshold for a long, while before descending, her skirts brushing the damp air. By the 4th step, her breath was visible. By the 7th, her breath was not visible at all, not because the air had warmed, but because there was no moisture in it to condense. The dryness was sudden, absolute, like the interior of a kiln. At the bottom, she found not darkness, but a faint gray glow, the kind of half-light that seems to have no source. And she saw that the far wall, the one beneath the warped paneling, upstairs, had been altered. A section of the earth and stone had been cleared away, forming a shallow recess. Within it were more bones, dozens of them, arranged in the shape of a rib cage so narrow it could not have housed a set of human lungs. And along the inner curve of those bones were small, faint scratches, each forming a neat vertical stroke, 19 in all. She reached out without meaning to, brushing her fingers against the cold white arc of a rib. It felt almost soft to the touch, though she knew bone could not be so. The instant she did, something brushed against her ankle. Not the sharp skitter of a rat, but the slow, deliberate curl of something thin and many-jointed. She jerked back and stumbled into the stairwell, her hand gripping the banister so hard the wood creaked. Timothy was standing at the top of the stairs when she emerged, his face level with hers though she had just climbed 12 steps. His eyes were utterly still, the pupils large enough to swallow the blue. Between his lips, she could see the faintest twitch of movement, as if something behind his teeth were shifting against them, deciding whether to emerge. That night, the sound in the walls changed. It was no longer the soft drag of fabric against wood. It had become a slow, rhythmic tapping, exactly like the sound of knuckles rapping on the underside of a coffin lid. By the 6th day, the town had already begun to notice that Timothy Caldwell's walks into Ashford had ceased. That, in itself, would not have been remarkable. The boy was frail, pale, unsuited to the biting wind that had begun to cut through the valley. But it was the manner of his absence that unsettled them. A child in a small place is rarely invisible. Yet for a full 6 days, no one had seen him crossing the square, lingering near the livery to watch the horses, or drifting silently behind his guardian when she visited the grocer. It was as though he had receded into the structure of the Caldwell house itself, folded into its walls like dried leaves between the pages of a book. Agnes began to move through the house differently. Her footsteps slowed in the hallways, her ears straining before she opened each door. There was a sense now, not of being watched, but of something drawing ever nearer without closing the distance. In the early mornings before she lit the stove, she would sometimes catch the faint odor of hot iron, the metallic tang of something heated until it glowed. It would vanish by the time the first kettle boiled. The bones on the kitchen table remained where she had first seen them. She could not bring herself to move them, though every day she fought the impulse to sweep them to the floor. They had become a fixed point in her vision, like a blemish on the skin that cannot be ignored and cannot be removed without pain. Timothy never touched them in her presence, yet she could not shake the belief that their arrangement, 7 in all, was deliberate, and that the number was not yet complete. On the 7th night, she woke to find her bedroom colder than the air outside. The frost that had crept along the inside of her window was not white, but faintly gray, and when she leaned close, she saw that the crystals were not random. They formed fine branching lines, each ending in a hook. She traced one with her finger until her skin ached from the cold, and only then did she see that the frost pattern resembled a series of hands, small, narrow hands, all reaching upward. She did not remember falling asleep again, but she woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps descending the cellar stairs. Not hurried, not stealthy, a steady, even tread, as though the person or thing moving below was entirely unafraid of being heard. She sat up, every muscle in her chest locking tight, and listened as the steps paused halfway down. The silence that followed was somehow worse. When she finally gathered herself to investigate, she found the cellar door closed tight, the bolt drawn from the inside. She called Timothy's name, softly at first, then sharply. The moment she spoke the second time, the bolt slid back of its own accord, and the door eased open an inch. A breath of air touched her cheek, not warm, not cold, but utterly still, as though it had been sealed away for years. She went down. She told herself she would go only far enough to see if Timothy was there, then turn back. Yet the deeper she descended, the more it seemed the light from the open door above could not follow her. The glow she had seen 2 nights before had returned, but it no longer confined itself to the recess in the far wall. Now it seemed to emanate faintly from the very soil, as though the ground had been sifted with pale ash. The arrangement of bones within the recess had changed. The narrow rib cage was now joined by a set of vertebrae, too small to have belonged to any adult. The scratches along the ribs had grown. 24 vertical strokes now, sharp and deliberate, their ends deep enough to catch her nail when she ran it across them. And there was something else. Resting neatly atop the bones, as though set there only moments before, was a strip of linen no wider than her hand. It was damp in one corner, and when she lifted it, a single drop of water fell from the edge and vanished into the dry soil. She raised it to her face, expecting the smell of mold or rot, but instead was met with the faint, sweet odor of milk. The instant she recognized it, something shifted in the dark behind her. It was not a step, not a fall of cloth. It was a slow, deliberate scraping, like fingernails trailing across the inside of a wooden lid. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw only the bare wall. Yet she could not convince herself the sound had stopped. It had simply moved, slipping into the bones themselves, into the pattern of the scratches, as though the marks were not carved but grown. When she returned to the kitchen, Timothy was seated at the table. The bones were gone. In their place was a small, shallow dish, filled to the brim with milk so pale it seemed to glow in the dim light. He did not look at her. He did not speak, but as she passed behind him, she saw that his shadow, cast faintly on the floor by the lamp, did not match his shape. By the 8th morning, Agnes realized she could no longer recall the sound of Timothy's voice. She knew he had spoken to her many times in those first days after the doctor left. Brief answers, murmured acknowledgments, but the memory of them was as fragile and smudged as ink left in the rain. It was not silence that filled the house now, but something heavier, a pressure in the air that made her ears ache, as though every wall were holding back a sound too deep to be heard. She began noticing small absences, each one insignificant in isolation, but intolerable in accumulation. A comb from her dresser, 2 spoons from the cutlery drawer, a brass curtain pin from the parlor window. By the time she noticed that the tin cup from the wash basin was gone, she felt sure she would find them all in the cellar if she dared to look again. But she did not. Not yet. The townspeople spoke less readily to her when she came into Ashford. Conversations would fall away as she approached. The blacksmith's wife, who had always been cordial, now crossed the street rather than pass near her. And once, when Agnes lingered too long at the apothecary's counter, she caught sight of 2 women watching her from the far end of the store, their expressions twisted in something that was not quite pity and not quite fear. One of them whispered to the other, and Agnes caught only a fragment, milk teeth, before they turned away. That night she heard the tapping for the first time. It came just before dawn, when the cold had sunk deepest into her bones, and it was so faint she almost mistook it for the creak of the rafters. But it repeated, in a steady rhythm, tap, tap, tap. Always 3 beats, a pause, then 3 again. She lay still in the dark, the covers pulled to her chin, her body rigid with the knowledge that the sound was not coming from the walls or the roof. It was coming from beneath her. By mid-morning, Timothy had vanished from the kitchen. She searched the house and found no sign of him, though the back door stood unlatched. She almost convinced herself he had gone to town, until she saw the small footprints in the frost by the porch, not leading away, but circling the house twice before ending at the cellar doors. When she finally forced herself to open them, the smell struck her first. Not decay, but the thick, damp odor of freshly turned earth, laced with the faintest trace of sweetness, as if roots had been disturbed. She descended only far enough to see the recess in the wall. The bones were there still, and beside them now was a shallow pit no larger than a cradle, the soil piled neatly on a folded quilt. Half buried at the edge of the pit was the brass curtain pin from the parlor. It protruded at an odd angle, as though it had been driven into something softer than earth. She reached for it, then froze as the soil in the pit shuddered. Just once, a brief, almost imperceptible tremor, and settled again. In the days that followed, the tapping grew, bolder, no longer confined to the early hours. Sometimes it moved from beneath her bedroom to the far corner of the kitchen, or to the floor beneath the front hall, tracing a slow, deliberate path through the house. Agnes stopped eating in the evenings, unable to stomach the thought of sitting at the table when the sound passed below her chair. The milk began to appear more frequently, always in shallow dishes, always filled to the brim so that the surface caught the light in a way that made it seem faintly luminous. She never saw Timothy place them, and yet she could feel his presence nearby whenever she discovered one, not in the room with her, but watching from just beyond the threshold. One night, while carrying an oil lamp to her bedroom, she caught sight of him in the hall mirror. He stood in the open doorway of the parlor, his head tilted slightly, his hands clasped before him. But the reflection was wrong. In the glass, the hands were not clasped. They were spread, fingers crooked, palms pressed flat to an unseen surface, as though he were on the other side of the glass, pushing toward her. Agnes did not look at him again that night. The next morning, she woke to find one of her own teeth on the nightstand. It was whole, intact, and she felt no pain in her mouth when she touched her tongue to each tooth in turn. And yet she knew it was hers. The root was still tinged pink. She wrapped it in linen and placed it in the drawer of her dressing table, telling herself it was only to be certain it did not vanish like the comb, the spoons, the curtain pin. But that night, when the tapping came again, it was closer than it had ever been, directly beneath the bed, and the rhythm had changed. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, almost as though it were counting. By the second week, the ground frost had deepened, locking the fields in a pale crust that crunched underfoot. Yet inside the Caldwell house, the air grew damp, as if the walls themselves sweated in the cold. Agnes kept the lamps burning later, into the night. Not for light, but to keep the shadows from crowding too close to the furniture. Even so, she began to sense that the house was holding its breath, that each passing hour without the tapping was not a reprieve, but a prelude. It came to her one evening while she was sewing in the parlor, a single sharp rap beneath the floorboards, so sudden she jabbed her finger with the needle. The blood welled up bright against her skin, and before she could press a rag to it, a drop had fallen to the wooden floor between her shoes. She froze, watching it spread in a thin, irregular circle. From the kitchen came the sound of glass shifting against wood. She rose, moving slowly, and found a shallow dish on the table, one she was certain had been washed and stacked away earlier. The milk inside was fresh enough to carry a faint warmth. She stood over it for a long moment, then noticed that her sewing needle, the very one she had just pricked herself with, was lying beside the dish. The needle was clean. That night she dreamed she was in the cellar, though the walls were closer and the ceiling lower than they should have been. She could not see the bones, but she could hear a wet rustling, like roots pushing through damp soil. Timothy's voice came from somewhere behind her, not speaking words but making a low, steady hum. When she turned, she found him standing only a foot away, but his face was blurred, as if her eyes had been smeared with grease. The hum rose in pitch, vibrating in her teeth until she woke with her jaw aching. Her pillow was wet. In the morning, she could not bring herself to check whether it was sweat or something else. Instead, she kept to the upstairs rooms, avoiding the cellar door entirely. Timothy appeared only in passing, at the end of a hallway in the yard through a window, but she began to notice the way he stood, always still, but with a faint lean forward, like someone straining to hear a whisper. By the third week, the tapping no longer stopped at night. It began in one corner of the house and traveled slowly through the floor, pausing beneath each room as though taking inventory of its contents. Sometimes it lingered longer under the bed, enough that she could feel a faint vibration in the mattress frame. Once, she placed her palm flat to the floorboards and thought she felt the faintest flutter of breath rising through the wood. On the morning of the 21st day, Agnes found the cellar doors unlatched again. A narrow path had been cleared in the frost from the back steps to the opening, the prints small but deep, as though made by bare feet in the frozen ground. She told herself not to look. She told herself to close the doors and bar them from the outside, but she went down. The pit was larger now, the soil banked higher at the edges. The bones had been moved, not discarded, but set neatly in a ring around the excavation, as though marking the perimeter of something sacred or dangerous. In the center lay the brass curtain pin, the missing spoons, the tin cup, and half a dozen other things she had not even noticed were gone. And among them, resting as delicately as a coin on display, was her tooth, still wrapped in linen. When she bent closer, she saw it clearly. The root was longer than it had been before, and the soil beneath it pulsed. She left the cellar without taking the tooth, but that night she dreamed of it again. this time not in the dirt, but in Timothy's palm. His hand was cold and pale, but when he curled his fingers around it, she could feel the faint rhythmic throb pass from the tooth into her jaw. He looked at her then, the blurred face resolving just enough for her to see that his eyes were not black, as she had feared, but milk white, the pupils pale and drowned. When she woke, she could taste earth in her mouth. The first hint came from an old surveyor named Willard Pike, a man whose boots and knuckles were worn to the same polish from decades of tracing property lines no one had questioned in years. He had stopped Agnes on the road one afternoon, squinting at her as if trying to see something behind her eyes. He asked, too casually, if she had heard him yet. She didn't answer, but her silence must have been enough. He nodded once, grim, and said only, "Best you keep to the rooms with no chimney." That night she could not shake the thought. No chimney? Nearly every room in the Caldwell house had one, even the small pantry off the kitchen. She tried to reason through. A draft? Rats? But the phrase hurt him made her stomach tighten. She had not told anyone about the humming. By the next week, her dreams became less like dreams and more like visits. She would open her eyes in the night and see the parlor or the pantry or the space under the cellar steps, all in perfect detail. She would be standing in them barefoot, hearing water drip in the distance. And then there would be the sound, not the tap, not the hum, but the scrape of a throat clearing, just behind her, always behind her. She never turned. One morning, she found Timothy sitting in the kitchen with a ledger open before him. It was not hers nor her late husband's, and it bore no name on the cover. Inside, the pages were lined with neat columns of dates, each followed by a short note. Voice clearer, longer tonight, now repeats sentences. The most recent entry read simply, "He will use her soon." When she reached for the book, Timothy slid. It toward her without resistance, but his gaze never left her face. She could not hold his eyes for long. It felt like pressing her palms to ice. The pages before the entries were older, the ink browned, the hand different. They spoke of the boy, of whisperings in the rafters, of tests conducted at night. A name appeared halfway through, Dr. Whitlow. She knew that name. Every child in the county knew it from hushed warnings, the same way one knows the names of rivers you must never swim in. Pike returned 3 days later, this time without speaking. He handed her a folded paper, yellowed and stiff, and left before she could open it. Inside was a single page torn from a larger record, a witness testimony from 1853. It spoke of children in the parish school who, one by one, began to speak in a voice not their own. It was described as deep, deliberate, and tinctured with the accent of the dead minister Whitlow. The accounts claimed that Whitlow had been hanged for heresy, but that his sermons were still heard in the mouths of the young for years after. The last line was written in a smaller, shakier hand. Timothy is the last. That night, Agnes stayed awake, every lamp in the house lit. Midnight passed quietly. The frost thickened on the windows, the flames swayed in the draft. Then from the parlor came a voice. It was not Timothy's. It was older, measured, speaking of binding the marrow and keeping the vessel pure. She could not make herself move. The voice spoke steadily for nearly an hour, never once, stopping to breathe. When it did end, it ended in mid-sentence, as if something had been cut off inside the speaker. Only then did she realize her mouth was dry, her throat aching. When she swallowed, the ache was deeper, like the rawness after. Long speech. She had not said a word, but her jaw felt used. By the time the thaw came, the road into Caldwell Hollow was more water than dirt, the ruts running with melt that shone like tarnished steel. In that half-light of March, Agnes began noticing people she didn't know walking the lane. Always. In pairs, always moving slow, their eyes never on the houses. They looked like they were measuring something, but their measuring was not done with tools. When they passed her gate, they would glance once toward the upper floor, toward Timothy's room, and then lower their gaze quickly as though they'd looked too long at the sun. The ledger lay open on her table most nights now. Timothy no longer hid it, and sometimes she suspected he wanted her to read. The newer entries were all in the same hand. Tight, slanting, not a child's script, not an adult's either. The words in the margins disturbed her more than the main lines. They were fragments. Keep spine straight, lungs not ready, she resists in sleep. One night she traced her finger down the page until she found something she didn't want to read twice. Next host must be of the bloodline. Her husband's people had been in this valley since before the Revolution. She had married into the Caldwell name, and with it came the house, the land, and apparently something else. Something no one had the courage to speak plainly. The history, when she finally pried it from Pike's reluctant mouth, was a story, told like a warning to keep a child from the cellar. The original Caldwell, a merchant named Nathaniel, had built the house with its twin chimneys and over-deep cellars in 1782. He had taken in a lodger, a circuit preacher named Whitlow, who repaid the hospitality by conducting sermons for the children of the valley. No one knew exactly what was said, but when the first winter ended, 3 of those children were dead, and 2 more had stopped speaking entirely. Whitlow was arrested, tried for unnatural instruction, and hanged in the square. His body was burned, the ashes scattered into the bay. But within the year, other children began to speak in his voice, reciting verses no one else had written down, but which every one of them repeated word for word. The valley's solution was crude and cruel. Any child found speaking with the voice was taken from their family, kept in an attic room, and observed. Sometimes the voice faded in weeks, other times it lasted years, and in at least one case, the child simply died mid-sentence. Agnes asked Pike the question that had been choking her since the first night she'd heard that voice from her parlor. What happens if it doesn't fade? He didn't answer. The spring brought Timothy's changes more sharply. His hair, always too pale for his age, took on a brittle texture. His posture was painfully upright, his chin held with the authority of someone twice, maybe 3 times. His years. He no longer hummed at night. Now, he prayed. Not in words Agnes knew, but in a rolling cadence that pressed into her ears until she could feel each syllable echo along her ribs. She began waking, with her tongue pressed to the roof of her mouth as though holding back a phrase. On more than one morning, she found her pillow damp, not with sweat, but with spit, as if she had been speaking for hours in her sleep. The worst morning was the one when she woke to find Timothy standing beside her bed, his lips not moving, but the voice flowing from him anyway, a deep, patient voice that said her maiden name, then her married one, then her father's. The ledger lay on her lap before she could even think to refuse it. On the newest page, in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it, were the words, "I will keep him until the next." The older pages of the ledger were brittle, browned at the edges. The ink bled just enough to make the writing look as though it had been breathed onto the paper instead of written. Agnes read them by lamplight while the rest of the house held its breath. Every entry followed the same pattern: a name, an age, a date taken in, and a note on duration. The dates stretched back more than 70 years. The first entry bore a name she recognized only from the headstones on the southern ridge. Anna Caldwell, age 9, duration, 11 months. Some notes were no more than a single word, faded, transferred, expired. Others dripped with precision, measuring not just days, but the moment of the final breath. A few bore something stranger, a symbol she didn't recognize, drawn in 3 strokes, always in the margin, and always beside the longest durations, the D. Last of these marked entry was 31 years ago. The child's name was Benjamin Holt, age 11. Duration unbroken. The note that followed made Agnes's chest tighten, kept until host ready. She turned back to earlier years. Each unbroken entry was followed by a gap, months or even years with no new child recorded until the next sudden arrival. It was as if they were not simply keeping the voice alive, but letting it rest. And the host always came from the Caldwell line. A slip of folded paper wedged between two pages fluttered loose and landed in her lap. It wasn't part of the ledger, but the handwriting matched the slanted script of the margins. It read, "The voice cannot die in open air. It must be carried to keep its shape. The child only holds it. The blood makes it stay." The paper trembled in her hand, though she was certain her fingers were still. The town's deference to Timothy began to deepen in ways Agnes could no longer ignore. At market, grown men would step aside for him. Women would nod, lips pressed tight, and some would whisper as he passed. Once, she saw the schoolmaster bow his head, not in greeting but as one might before an altar. Timothy began to ask about the cellars. He said it as if it were nothing, as though he simply wished to see what lay beneath the stone floor. But the first time she refused, his eyes locked on hers and held for a long, cold second. That night she dreamed she was in those cellars. They smelled of damp wool and stone, but under it was something metallic. In the far corner, a line of narrow beds stretched against the wall, each with a small folded blanket at the foot. Every bed was empty, except for one. In that one lay her own body, eyes open, mouth slightly parted as if listening. She woke to the sound of the back door closing, the smell of cold air and wet earth on the stairs. When she checked Timothy's room, the bed was empty, but his voice came from the parlor, not singing, not praying, but speaking steadily as if delivering instructions to someone she could not see. In the morning, the trap door to the cellar was unlatched. She found footprints in the dust she had not disturbed in years. One set small, bare, and recent. Another larger and so old the dust had begun to reclaim them. In the margin of the next page of the ledger, written in her own cramped letters, was the phrase, "To now. Both willing." Agnes began to watch Timothy as one might watch a clock whose hands had begun to move in unfamiliar increments. He was still a boy by any ordinary measure, his limbs thin, his hair falling into his eyes. Yet there were moments when his stillness seemed older than the room itself. He no longer moved through the house as children do, by bursts and clatter, but with a steady pacing, pausing at thresholds as though listening for some cue before stepping across. She started keeping the ledger hidden in her sewing chest, though she knew it was useless. Twice she found it back on the kitchen table, open to the same page, the slip of paper about the host lying on top. The second time, she was certain she had locked the chest. The cellar became a presence in the house again. At night, she would hear the wood above it settle, except it wasn't the boards, it was steps. Slow, dragging steps that began at the trap door and retreated into the earth. When she opened the hatch in daylight, nothing stirred, but there was a smell now, faint yet persistent, like seawater left too long in a bucket. Timothy began to carry his voice differently. It was deeper now, not in pitch, but in weight, a resonance that seemed to take the air between his words and stretch it thin. People in town said little, but their eyes betrayed something between awe and dread. Mrs. Harrow, who had lived through the Whitlow trial as a girl, made the sign of the cross when he passed her in the lane. One afternoon, she caught Timothy in the yard, speaking into the well. Not calling down, not asking after an echo. Speaking to it in long, measured phrases, pausing as though to hear an answer. When he saw her, he smiled. It was not the smile of a boy. That night, she dreamed. again of the cellar, but this time there was no line of beds. Instead, the room was filled with water up to her knees, and something moved just beneath the surface, circling slowly. The water was cold enough to ache in her bones, yet she could not step out of it. Timothy stood on the stone steps, dry, watching her, and when he spoke, it was not his voice. She woke with her feet damp. The quilt was dry, the floorboards too, but when she reached for her slippers, she found them soaked through, the faint smell of brine rising from the fabric. 2 nights later, she descended into the cellar with a lantern. The air was colder then. She remembered, the walls slick with moisture. In the far corner where the beds had been in her dream, she found 2 chairs. One was child-sized, the wood worn smooth where hands had gripped the arms for years. The other was taller, its seat stained dark, as if with ink. Both faced the same blank wall. Scratched into the stone, waist-high on the taller chair's side, were 27 short vertical marks, each no longer than the width of a fingernail. She counted them twice. She did not know if they marked years, or something else entirely. From above, she heard Timothy's voice. It carried through the stone, clearer than it should have. And yet there was a second tone under it, almost identical, moving half a breath behind. When she returned upstairs, he was sitting at the table with the ledger open. His hand rested on the margin, his fingers covering something newly written. When she tried to take the book, he didn't move his hand, but he looked up at her and said, "It will be you next. They've already agreed." The first snow of that winter came early, laying a brittle crust over the yard and dulling the edges of the horizon. The town began to close itself inward, and yet Timothy went out more than before. He wandered the old paths toward the salt marshes, disappearing for hours, returning with his hair tangled by wind and his boots leaving wet marks across the kitchen floor. Agnes tried to follow him once, but after half a mile, she lost sight of him among the reeds. The sound there was wrong. The wind moving through the stalk seemed to break mid-note, leaving a gap that made her ears strain for the rest of the tone. When she turned back toward the road, she was certain the marsh grass had shifted, narrowing, the path behind her. One evening, he brought home a folded scrap of paper, the edges soft with handling. It was old, the ink browned and faint, but she could make out the seal pressed into the corner. Not the county's, but the same odd emblem she had seen on the ledger's flyleaf, a circle with 7 spokes, each tipped with a small mark like a tear. Beneath the seal was a list of names. She recognized none except the last, Caleb Harrow, written in a hand that seemed fresher than the rest, as though it had been added later. She did not need to ask who he was. She remembered the thin, pale boy from her own childhood, the one who had stopped speaking after the Whitlow trial, whose lips moved without sound when the bell rang for Mass. That night, Timothy did not come to supper. She found him in the cellar, sitting in the child's chair, staring at the wall. In the lantern light, the marks she had counted before seemed deeper, the edges roughened, as though carved with fresh pressure. There were 28 now. When she asked what they meant, he lifted his hand and tapped the wall in a slow rhythm. Tap, 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 pausing between each as if to listen for a reply. Then he whispered something she could not catch. The words were swallowed by the stone, yet the air in the room seemed to pulse faintly after each syllable, as though the walls themselves were drawing breath. A week later, Mrs. Harrow was found, dead in her bed. The coroner said her heart had stopped in her sleep, but Agnes heard the undertaker's assistant muttering about her jaw being clenched so tightly it had cracked 2 molars. No one opened the shutters on her house after the burial. Timothy began sleeping less. She would wake in the dark and hear him moving about, not the shuffling of a restless boy, but a measured circuit, across the kitchen, past the parlor, stopping at each doorway as though counting them. Sometimes he lingered outside her room, the ledger, once merely strange, now seemed to alter itself. Pages she had never seen appeared, with dates from long before her birth. Some described visitations, children born with voices that were not entirely their own, chosen to carry something forward. One page, written in a cramped and uneven hand, spoke of the return, when the voice would not need to pass on but would settle permanently into one host. The ink in that entry had smudged into shapes almost like fingerprints. One morning, the trapdoor to the cellar was open. Timothy was gone, but on the kitchen table lay the scrap of paper with the list of names. Her own was now at the bottom, in the same fresh hand as Caleb Harrow's. When he returned, his boots were dry despite the thawing snow outside. His eyes were wide, and the voice he used to say, "They're ready for you now," seemed to come from deeper in the room than where he stood. The thaw came late that year, the ground reluctant to yield the frost that had locked it for months. Agnes tried to believe spring would dissolve the thing pressing on the house, but the air inside remained colder than the fields outside. Shadows clung to the walls long after the sun rose, retreating only when Timothy moved through them. He had grown taller since the autumn, but not in the way of boys. It was a lengthening, a stretching, as if the space between his joints had been claimed by something else. His hands were almost too large for his wrists now, his fingers lingering too long when they touched the doorframe, the banister, her shoulder. He spoke less often, and when he did, she caught the faintest echo before he opened his mouth as if another had spoken first from just beyond the room. The ledger lay open on the table most days. The pages no longer shifted only when she turned them. Now she would leave the room and return to find a different entry exposed, the handwriting subtly altered as though the ink had only just dried. She began to notice faint indentations beneath, certain names, as if someone had pressed their finger there for a long while before moving on. On the morning of the equinox, Timothy asked her to come to the cellar. The request was simple, but the words felt wrong, as if they were carrying more weight than they should. She followed him down the narrow steps, the lantern's flame stretching thin in the damp air. The wall with the marks stood before her. There were 43 now. Some were fresh, the dust from their carving still resting in the cracks of the stone. At their center, in a cleared space she swore had not existed the week before, was the circle and spokes emblem, cut deep enough to draw, a bead of moisture from the wall's inner surface. Timothy placed her hand against it. The stone was warm, pulsing faintly like the skin of some sleeping thing. From within came the sound, not quite voices, not quite wind, but a layered murmur that rose and fell in patterns almost like breath. He told her, in that not quite his voice, that the others had waited for her, that the ledger was merely a record, but the wall was the keeping place, that every name carved within its shadow had carried the voice until it no longer needed to move on. Her knees weakened, but his grip kept her upright. The air thickened, pressing into her ears until she felt the beat of her own heart slowing to match the rhythm of the stone. In that narrowing moment, she understood that the trial of Father Whitlow had never ended, only hidden itself in smaller rooms, quieter houses, and that the children who had preached in his voice had never truly died. The last thing she saw before the lantern went out was Timothy's mouth, moving in perfect time with the murmur from the wall. And when the darkness folded in, she could still hear him, not from beside her, but from within the stone itself, calling her name, over and over until it was no longer a name at all, only a sound that she could not stop repeating in her own head. No one in the town recorded her death. The ledger remained in the house, waiting on the table for the next to find it. And in the cellar, the marks on the wall stood at 44.